The wind screamed through the high valley, hurling snow like shattered glass across the open fields of Callahan Ranch. It wasn't a normal storm. This was something mean, something with teeth. A loose shutter banged against the barn, a frantic, desperate rhythm in the gale. From inside, a low, pained whinny echoed, a sound that cut through the wind and straight into Nate Callahan's gut. He yanked the heavy barn door open, fighting the storm's angry push. A sheet of ice-cold rain slashed his face, blinding him for a second. When his vision cleared, the sight before him sent a jolt of pure, white-hot anger through his chest. It was Jet, his best stallion, a black thoroughbred worth more than the entire town. He was lying on his side, his powerful chest heaving in ragged, desperate bursts. Blood, dark and stark, speckled the golden straw near his flank. A jagged piece of broken wood, snapped from a support beam, had pierced the animal's skin. Above them both, the roof sagged dangerously, groaning under the weight of the storm, just one good gust away from collapsing entirely. "Damn it," Nate muttered, the words swallowed by the wind. He shoved his shoulder into the broken gate, his muscles straining, and began the slow, painful process of dragging the terrified animal to its feet. The horse stumbled, its eyes wide with pain and fear, but it leaned into him, trusting the calm, steady strength in his hands. It always did. Nate guided Jet to a safer stall, his boots sinking into the muck that had turned the barn floor into a swamp of mud and manure. He worked with a grim focus, his mind shutting out everything but the task at hand. By the time the storm finally broke, exhausted and spent, the eastern wall of the barn was a wreck. Wooden planks hung like broken ribs, and the smell of damp hay and decay clung to the air. Nate stood there, chest heaving, his broad-shouldered frame soaked to the bone. He was a man used to solving problems with his own two hands, a man who had built an empire from nothing. But this was too much for one man alone. And he didn't know it yet, but this broken barn was about to break his entire world wide open. The next morning, Nate rode into town with a single purpose. He hated town. He hated the gossip, the lingering stares from folks who didn't know what to make of him. They'd whisper about the millionaire hermit, the man who'd vanished from society to live among horses and mountains. A man who could dine with railroad barons one year and vanish into the Montana wilds the next. But he was out of options. He needed help. He pinned a simple hand-scrawled note to the wall of the local saloon right next to the wanted posters. Help needed to clean cabins and stables, daily pay, no questions asked. He didn't expect anyone to show. The people in town kept their distance, a mix of respect and fear. They didn't understand a man like him. He didn't understand them either. He rode back to the ranch, the silence of the valley his only companion, convinced he'd be cleaning up the mess himself. He was wrong. 3 days later, as the last of the morning frost melted on the ranch fence, Nate spotted a figure. It was a thin shape, walking up the long dirt road, moving slowly, her steps deliberate, as if every inch of ground had to be earned. Her gray shawl flapped in the cold wind, a battered hat hiding most of her face. When she stopped at the gate, all Nate could see was a pale cheek, sharp from hunger and hardship. "I'm here for the job," she said. Her voice caught him off guard. It was quiet but steady, tired, like a river that had been running too long but hadn't dried up yet. "You know how to clean stables?" Nate asked, his tone rougher than he'd intended. She gave a small, simple nod. "Name's Linda Rock." She didn't ask about the pay. She didn't ask where she'd stay. She didn't ask a single thing. She simply followed him to the barn, rolled up the sleeves of her worn dress, and got to work. And Nate Callahan, a man who thought he'd seen everything, was about to learn that the biggest storms don't always come from the sky. Linda was unlike any woman Nate had ever met. In the city, the women were soft, draped in silks and smelling of perfume. Out here on the frontier, they were tough, but they talked, they laughed, they complained. Linda did none of that. She was a ghost. She didn't flinch at the filth in the barn or the biting wind that crept through the gaps in the broken walls. She went straight to the blood-stained corner near Jet's old stall and began to scrub, her movements methodical, relentless, until the wood showed its natural color again. She hauled buckets of water with hands that were already red and raw. When a tool was too heavy, she didn't ask for help. She improvised, dragging it with a stubborn persistence that made Nate pause his own work just to watch her. He found himself wanting to ask her questions. "Where did you come from? Why do you look like you haven't had a warm meal in a week?" But the set of her jaw, the silent, fierce determination in her movements, told him that whatever answers she carried were not meant for strangers. She never, not once, looked him in the eye. By sunset, the barn no longer reeked of wet manure and decay. It smelled of fresh hay and clean timber. Linda rinsed her hands in the icy water of the trough, wiped them on her skirt, and left without a word. Just like that. Gone. Nate watched her silhouette vanish down the winding road, her small figure swallowed by the darkening trees. That night, the ranch felt colder than usual. Colder and bigger. The grand empty house he'd built, with its polished mahogany floors and wide windows overlooking the valley, seemed to echo with a kind of silence that gnaws at a man's soul. He sat at the long dining table, his supper untouched, and found his thoughts wandering back to the strange woman who cleaned his stables like a soldier on a mission. Why did she come alone? And why did she always leave before dark, as if she were running from something? Or someone? His mind, usually so focused on business ledgers and horse bloodlines, refused to let the questions go. For the first time in months, maybe years, Nate couldn't sleep. The memory of her raw, chapped hands and that look of quiet, unbreakable defiance in her eyes burned in his mind. He rose before dawn, a saddle in his hand, the restlessness pushing him out into the cold. If that storm hadn't nearly destroyed his barn, he might never have crossed paths with this woman. And yet something deep within him whispered that she was more than just a laborer looking for a day's wage. When the sun finally rose, Nate was standing by the barn, watching the empty dirt road where she'd appear. He didn't know what he was searching for, answers maybe, or just the confirmation that she was real. And somewhere deep inside, a new, unfamiliar thought began to grow. Who is Linda Rock, and what in God's name is she hiding? The following morning, the frost still clung to the edges of the ranch fences like lace made of ice. Nate woke before the sun had cleared the mountain peaks, his breath a white cloud in the cold air of his bedroom. He pulled on his heavy coat and boots, trying to shake off the strange restlessness that had settled over him since Linda Rock first walked up his road. She arrived just after dawn, a familiar silhouette against the pale morning sky, walking up the same dirt road, her shawl drawn tight against the cutting wind. Nate was pretending to repair a broken fence post when he spotted her. He wanted to seem busy, casual. She gave him a single nod, a gesture that was neither warm nor distant, and went straight to the barn. No chatter, no pleasantries. Just work. Nate followed her quietly, leaning against the stable door, pretending to inspect the hinges. He just wanted to watch. Linda had already rolled up her sleeves, revealing forearms that were thin but sinewy, her skin raw from cold water and harsh soap. She began cleaning the corner near Jet's stall, where the blood had dried into dark, ugly patches. With an almost mechanical rhythm, she scrubbed, rinsed, and scrubbed again, as if her entire life depended on scouring away every last mark of that night. "Did you sleep well last night?" Nate asked. He tried to make his voice sound casual, but it came out edged with a curiosity he couldn't hide. Linda didn't look up from her work. "I slept," she said simply. Her voice was flat, offering nothing. "You could stay in the cabin near the paddock if you want," he pushed, gesturing vaguely. "It's empty, but I can have it cleaned and stocked. It's warm." She didn't even pause. "No need," she replied, rinsing the rag in the bucket of murky water. "I'm fine where I am." Nate frowned. There was something unnatural about the way she dismissed comfort, as though accepting any small kindness might shatter whatever thin, invisible shield she lived behind. He lingered, folding his arms across his broad chest. "You'll earn more if you stay past sunset," he offered, testing her. "More work to be done." Linda finally paused, wringing the water from the rag with a force that seemed impossible for her small hands. "I'll leave when the day's work is done," she said, her voice soft, yet as unyielding as the mountains themselves. "Not later." Nate tilted his head, studying her profile. The sharpness of her cheekbones, the determined line of her lips, the quiet burning intensity in her every motion. Everything about her whispered of someone carrying a burden so heavy it was a wonder she could still walk. He wanted to ask, "What are you running from?" But something in her stillness, in the rigid set of her shoulders, warned him to keep silent. By midday, Linda had scrubbed and swept the barn until even the oldest stains were gone. Nate tried to distract himself with repairs, tightening hinges and checking feed supplies, but his attention kept sliding back to her. She worked with a kind of desperate urgency, as if every second counted, yet she refused even the smallest break. When he brought out fresh bread and a steaming pot of coffee, she merely shook her head and said, "I brought something." The something turned out to be a small folded cloth with a single dry scrap of bread inside. Nate watched as she broke it in half, carefully setting one piece aside in a small tin she pulled from her pocket. It was a strange, precise action. Was she saving it for later, or for someone else? As the day drew to a close and the shadows grew long, Linda packed her tools and stood, wiping her hands on her skirt. "That's enough for today," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Nate watched as she tightened her shawl and started down the road. There was no horse waiting for her, no wagon to take her home. She simply walked into the shadowed forest path, her back straight, her pace steady and unwavering. Something gnawed at Nate. He had seen women like her in the city once, women abandoned by husbands or families, doing whatever they could to keep going. But this felt different. There was a mystery in the way she moved, a silence that seemed less like shyness and more like a carefully guarded wall. The next morning was the same. She arrived early, worked hard, and left before the sky turned to gold. And the next. By the fifth day, Nate's curiosity had sharpened into something restless and relentless. He couldn't take it anymore. That evening, when the sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the valley in deep shades of purple and orange, Nate made a decision. He saddled his chestnut horse, a fast, quiet mare, pulled on his gloves, and set off silently, following the faint outline of her figure on the path. Linda didn't seem to notice. She walked with purpose, never looking over her shoulder, her steps quick and sure despite the uneven ground. The trail grew narrow, lined with pine and brittle shrubs. The deeper Nate followed, the more the air smelled of wood smoke and damp moss. He kept his distance, his heart thudding with a strange mix of guilt and anticipation. Why was he doing this? He wasn't the kind of man who pried into other people's lives. His own life was a fortress built to keep people out. Yet, there was something about Linda that drew him in, something that told him she was hiding a story far more painful than she let on. After nearly half an hour of walking, Linda veered off the main trail. She cut through a thick patch of underbrush, heading toward what looked like an abandoned clearing. Nate stopped just before the trees opened up, dismounting his horse to move quietly on foot. He crept forward, his boots silent on the pine needles. Through the last of the branches, he saw it. A cabin, if you could even call it that. The structure leaned dangerously to one side, its roof sagging under years of neglect and heavy snow. The door was nothing but a threadbare blanket, flapping in the breeze. A faint, flickering light came from within. Nate was about to turn back, telling himself he'd seen enough, that he had no right to spy on this woman's poverty. But then, he heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was laughter. Not loud, not careless. It was the soft, gentle laughter of children, the kind of sound that can warm a room, even when the air outside is freezing. He stepped closer, drawn by a force he couldn't name or resist. Peering through a wide gap in the wall, Nate saw Linda. She was on her knees by a small, smoky fire, and her face was completely transformed. The hardness was gone, replaced by a tenderness so profound it made Nate's breath catch in his throat. A barefoot little girl with tangled hair ran into her arms, giggling, while two small boys played on the dirt floor with a wooden spoon and a broken tin cup. An older girl, maybe 11 or 12, stood watch by the blanket door, her eyes alert but full of a quiet, weary trust. A sharp, unfamiliar ache bloomed in Nate's chest. Linda wasn't just a quiet drifter. She was a mother. And these 4 children, thin, shoeless, yet so full of life, were her entire world. As the cold night settled over the clearing, Nate slipped back into the shadows. The image burned into his mind. Linda holding her children close, her tired, beautiful face glowing in the firelight. He rode home in a deafening silence, his own thoughts louder than the wind. For years, Nate had believed wealth could protect a man from loneliness, that hard work and land ownership were enough to fill the hollow places inside. But that night, as he dismounted at his grand, empty ranch, he realized something new had awakened in him. Something stronger than curiosity, something that felt dangerously like longing. And for the first time in a very long time, Nate Callahan lay awake, wondering not about his horses, his land, or his fortune, but about a woman named Linda Rock and the 4 children waiting for her in a broken-down cabin in the woods. The next morning dawned with a hard frost, the kind that turned the entire world silver before the sun could warm the valley. Nate stood by the window of his ranch house, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hand. His gaze wasn't on the rolling hills or the prized horses in the paddock. It lingered on the memory of what he had seen in the woods. Linda's face, illuminated by firelight, her arms wrapped around 4 children who had nothing but her love to keep them safe from the world. When Linda arrived, she looked just as she always did. Gray shawl pulled tight, eyes lowered, her expression a steady, unreadable mask. Nate watched her for a moment longer than usual before he spoke. "You have a long walk every night," he said, his voice quiet. She didn't stop coiling the rope she'd used to tie up the hay bales. "I manage." "Manage isn't living," he muttered, more to himself than to her. But he didn't push. The tension in her shoulders, the way she refused to meet his eyes, told him she wasn't ready to talk. Not yet. Still, he couldn't shake the image of her children sleeping on a cold dirt floor while she scraped manure here with her bare hands. When she left that evening, Nate found himself pacing the length of the barn. He looked at the polished saddles hanging in a neat row, the sacks of premium feeds stacked high in the corner, the piles of fresh, sweet-smelling hay. All the comforts he could provide without a second thought. Meanwhile, Linda and her children were surviving on scraps and raw courage. The next morning, long before Linda was due to arrive, he filled a heavy burlap sack. He put in a bag of flour, a slab of smoked bacon, a dozen eggs, and a thick bar of soap wrapped in clean cloth. He left it hanging on a nail just outside the shed, where she kept her cleaning rags. He said nothing when she arrived. He didn't wait around for thanks. It was a quiet offering, a gesture of respect more than charity. Or so he told himself. Linda noticed the bag halfway through her morning chores. She stopped dead, her hands tightening on the handle of the broom she was using. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Her eyes softened, and for a split second, Nate thought she might cry. But then her jaw set, that familiar wall of pride snapping back into place. Without a word, she turned and finished her work. She left the barn at her usual time, just as the sun began to set. Nate waited an hour before going to check. The sack was gone. But in its place, placed neatly on the workbench, was a small, worn coin and a note written in faint, spidery script. "Please no more. I work to live, not to accept charity." There was no signature. None was needed. He read the note twice, the 4 simple words hitting him like a hammer. He folded it carefully and slid it into his pocket. Something about her pride, her fierce independence, struck him deep. This wasn't just a woman trying to survive. This was a mother determined to stand on her own 2 feet, no matter how hard the ground was beneath her. The days passed, but Nate couldn't stop himself from making small gestures. He left a pair of thick work gloves on the workbench the next day. A few days later, a sturdy wooden comb. He didn't leave food again. He understood her boundaries now. Linda never mentioned the items, but he noticed she used them. When she cleaned the stalls with the new gloves on, her hands no longer bled from the harsh bristles and the cold water. Their silence began to change. It was still there, but it felt different. Sometimes, when Linda was working, she would glance up briefly, her eyes meeting his for just a second, a silent, fleeting acknowledgement. Sometimes Nate would linger longer than necessary in the barn, pretending to inspect the feed or check a horse's shoe, but really just watching her. It wasn't romantic, not in the way stories described it. It was quieter, deeper, something built of shared spaces and unspoken understanding. Then, late one afternoon, as the golden light slipped over the hills, Nate saw someone at the edge of the barn. A boy, no more than 10 years old, stood there clutching a small woven basket. His hair was a tangled mess, and his cheeks were streaked with dirt, but he looked nervous, not afraid. "You the one who gave my mama that bread?" the boy asked, his voice clear. Nate blinked, surprised. I suppose I am." The boy lifted the basket with both hands, a serious, formal offering. Inside were 6 eggs, still warm from the nest, some with tiny brown feathers still clinging to the shells. "Mama says you should never come empty-handed," the boy said, repeating a lesson he'd clearly heard many times. Nate felt something twist in his chest, something tight and painful and wonderful all at once. He took the basket gently, as if holding something fragile and sacred. "Thank you," he said, his own voice quieter than usual. The boy gave him a quick, shy smile, then turned and ran back down the path toward the woods, disappearing into the trees as quickly as he'd appeared. Nate stood there for a long moment, staring down at the eggs, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. It was like a door deep inside him. A door he'd bolted shut long ago, had just creaked open a little. That night, he placed the eggs in a bowl on his big, empty kitchen table. Beside them, he left a note written in his rough, blocky handwriting. "Thank you, and tell your mama not every gift needs to be repaid." He doubted Linda would ever see it, but just writing it made him feel closer to something he couldn't yet name. Over the next week, Nate found himself waking earlier than usual, not because of chores, but because he wanted the barn to look better, cleaner, warmer for Linda. He replaced the rotting boards in the back corral. He oiled the big door hinges so they no longer squeaked and groaned. He patched a leak in the roof and swept out the loft, telling himself it was all for the horses, but knowing, deep down, it was for her. Linda noticed. She didn't say anything, but sometimes he'd catch her gaze lingering on a new plank or a tightened nail, her expression unreadable but softer than before. On a particularly cold morning, as Linda prepared to leave, Nate tried once more. "You know," he said, leaning casually against the barn door, There's plenty of room in the bunkhouse if you and your... He stopped himself just before he said, children. She hadn't told him about them, and he wasn't ready to admit he knew. It felt like a secret he was protecting for her. Linda's back stiffened instantly. I'm fine, she said curtly. We're fine. The word struck him like a bell. There was no mistaking it. Her life wasn't solitary. She had someone, maybe more than one, depending on her. Nate let her go without another word, but his thoughts burned like hot coals long after the sun had set. He didn't follow her that night. He didn't need to. Instead, he sat on his porch, watching the stars prick the dark sky, wondering how a man with more wealth than he could ever spend had found himself so restless, so completely fixated on a woman who wanted nothing from him but a day's pay. He thought of the boy with the basket of eggs. He thought of Linda's hands, raw but unshaking. He thought of the firelight in that broken-down cabin. By the time he finally fell asleep in his chair, Nate had already made up his mind. He would not leave things as they were. He would find a way to help her, to help them, whether she asked for it or not. The following afternoon, a new storm began to gather over the mountains, dark clouds crawling down the peaks like wolves. Nate stood at the edge of the porch, watching the wind sweep across the valley, bending the tall grass. Somewhere out there, Linda and those children were bracing against the coming cold, with nothing but a thin cabin and a mother's sheer willpower. The thought of them in that fragile, broken place made his jaw tighten. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, he would ride out there and see for himself just how bad things really were. And if it was worse than he imagined, he wouldn't just stand by and watch anymore. The storm rolled closer, the sky turning a bruised purple, setting the stage for what was coming next. And it was going to be so much worse than he could ever imagine. The storm broke over the valley with a fury that felt personal, slamming into the hills and rattling every loose board on the ranch. Nate tightened the shutters on his porch and glanced toward the dark line of pines where Linda had vanished earlier that evening. He hadn't seen her leave, and the thought of her and those children caught in this weather made his gut twist into a tight, hard knot. Rain lashed across the barn roof, drumming like the roll of distant thunder. The horses inside were restless, their hooves pounding nervously against the wooden floors. Jet, still healing from the cut on his flank, let out a shrill, panicked cry. Nate went to check the stalls, adjusting blankets and murmuring low words of reassurance, his hands gentle on their powerful necks. But even as he worked, his mind kept drifting back to the image of Linda's cabin, small, fragile, half buried in the woods, with that pathetic blanket for a door. By nightfall, the wind was howling like a living thing, shaking the massive barn doors until the iron hinges groaned in protest. Nate stood in the doorway, the rain soaking the brim of his hat and running in cold trickles down his neck. He could feel the pull of instinct, that unshakable voice deep inside telling him something wasn't right. Linda might be proud enough to refuse charity, but pride was no match for a storm like this. A storm like this could rip the roof right off her shelter. And those children? He didn't waste another second debating. Within minutes, Nate had saddled his strongest chestnut mare and was riding headfirst into the storm. The rain hit his face like 1,000 tiny needles, and the path toward the woods was already slick with mud and littered with fallen branches. The deeper he went, the darker it became, the trees crowding together like a solid black wall, their branches clawing at him as he passed. When he finally reached the clearing, his worst fears were confirmed. It was even worse than he'd imagined. The cabin leaned at a terrifying angle, looking like it might collapse at any second. One corner of the flimsy roof had already caved in, leaving a gaping hole open to the punishing sky. Through a gap in the wall, he saw the frantic flicker of firelight and panicked movement. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the mud, and yelled her name over the roar of the wind. "Linda!" The threadbare blanket that served as a door flew open. Linda stood there, her face pale and streaked with rainwater, her eyes wide with shock and fear. "Nate," she breathed, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Get the kids," he ordered, his voice sharp and commanding. "This place won't last another hour." "I can't just—" she began, but another furious gust of wind sent a violent shudder through the entire structure. A support beam overhead creaked ominously. Linda's protest died on her lips. Inside, the children were huddled together in a corner, their wide, terrified eyes reflecting the sputtering firelight. The oldest, Nala, clutched little Ruth to her chest, trying to shield her from the wind and rain whipping through the broken roof. The boys, Leo and Tom, stared at Nate as if they weren't sure whether to fear him or run to him. "Come on," Nate said, his voice softening as he knelt to their level. "I have a big house on the other side of the hill. It's warm and it's safe. You can't stay here tonight." Linda looked at him, her face a mask of torn pride and raw desperation. Finally, with a small, defeated nod, she whispered, "All right, but only until the storm passes." Nate gathered the children quickly, wrapping them in whatever dry cloth he could find. He lifted the smallest one, Ruth, into his arms. Her tiny, cold fingers immediately clung to his collar. He led the way out into the raging storm. "We'll make 2 trips," he said. "I'll take the boys first, then come back for you and the girls." Linda shook her head, her jaw set with that familiar stubbornness. "We'll all go together. We've walked worse roads than this." The journey back to the ranch was a grueling nightmare. The rain turned the ground to a thick, sucking sludge, and the wind howled through the trees like a banshee. Nala held Tom's hand in a death grip, and Leo trudged beside them, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. Nate walked beside the horse, using his own body to shield Linda and the children from the worst of the wind. When they finally reached the ranch, the sight of the large, warm house with golden light spilling from its windows made Nala gasp in quiet awe. Inside, Nate stoked the fire until it roared to life, filling the room with golden light and the welcome crackle of dry wood. He handed Linda a thick woolen blanket, but she hesitated before accepting it. "You don't have to do this," she murmured, her eyes on the floor. "I know," he said simply, meeting her gaze until she had to look at him. "But I want to." The children gathered near the hearth, their damp clothes steaming in the sudden warmth. Ruth leaned against Linda's shoulder, half asleep already, while Leo and Tom fought a losing battle to keep their eyes open. Nala, ever the protector, sat stiffly beside them, trying to be brave. Nate disappeared into the kitchen and returned with 4 mugs of warm milk, pressing one gently into each child's hands. "Drink," he said. "It'll help." Leo looked up at him, his eyes suspicious at first, but after one tentative sip, the boy's face softened. "It's good," he whispered as if it were a secret. Linda knelt by the fire, drying Ruth's tangled hair with the corner of a blanket. Nate stood nearby, watching them with a feeling he couldn't quite name, something heavy and warm and aching all at once. Later, when the storm had finally quieted to a soft, rhythmic patter against the windows, Linda rose to her feet. "We'll be gone by morning," she said quietly, her voice firm again. Nate shook his head. "Not until that cabin is safe. You and the children are not going back there. That place is falling apart." Linda's lips pressed into a thin, hard line, but this time she didn't argue. She looked down at Ruth, who had curled up on the rug with Tom, their breaths slow and even in sleep. The firelight danced across her face, revealing the bone-deep exhaustion she tried so hard to hide. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. "You don't even know us." Nate hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I've spent years alone in a house that's too big for one man," he said finally. "Because no one should have to fight a storm like this alone, especially not with children." Linda's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she quickly turned away, hiding her face in the shadows. They didn't speak again for the rest of the night. Nate sat in the big armchair near the fire, listening to the quiet, peaceful breathing of the sleeping children, while Linda dozed in a chair across the room, her shawl finally slipping from her weary shoulders. Something had shifted between them, something fundamental that neither of them could quite define. When dawn came, the storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and glistening with frost and dew. Nate rose early, making coffee and checking on the horses. When he returned to the house, Linda was already awake, standing by the window with her shawl wrapped tight around her once again. "We'll leave as soon as the kids wake up," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. Nate studied her, the stubbornness back in her eyes, the pride in her posture. "You don't have to," he said. "Not yet." She didn't answer, but he saw the flicker of uncertainty in her gaze, the way she glanced at her children still sleeping peacefully by the fire. As the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the valley, Nate knew this was far from over. This wasn't just about a broken cabin anymore. Something told him Linda's story was just beginning to unfold, and he was already in too deep to ever walk away. The morning light crept into the ranch house, soft and golden, brushing over the sleeping children curled up by the hearth like a litter of puppies. Nate stood in the doorway, a mug of steaming coffee in his hand, watching the scene with a feeling he couldn't quite place. It was strange. For years, this house had been a place of perfect order, polished and silent, a fortress. Now it was messy, it was noisy, it felt warm, it felt alive. Linda stirred, shifting in the wooden chair where she'd fallen asleep. When her eyes opened, they darted instantly toward the children, and a wave of visible relief washed over her face when she saw they were still there, still safe. She glanced at Nate then, her expression cautious, guarded, but softer than before. "You didn't have to keep watch all night," she said, her voice raspy from sleep. Nate just shrugged. Didn't mind it. He handed her a fresh mug of coffee, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted it. Their fingers brushed briefly, sending a strange jolt of warmth through him that had nothing to do with the fire. It was a spark he hadn't felt in a very long time. By mid-morning, the children were awake, shyly exploring the large ranch kitchen. Nala, the eldest, kept her younger siblings close, her watchful gaze flicking between them and Nate, as if she were still weighing whether this place, this man, could truly be trusted. Ruth, the youngest, clung tightly to Linda's dress, staring wide-eyed at the polished wooden table and the row of gleaming copper pots hanging along the wall. "You can sit," Nate said gently, nodding toward the long bench. "There's more than enough food here." The children hesitated, looking to their mother for permission. Only when Linda gave a small, almost imperceptible nod did they clamber up onto the bench, their small hands folded nervously in their laps. Nate sliced warm bread from a fresh loaf, spread thick butter over each slice, and set them down in front of each child. The sight of them devouring the food, trying but failing to hide their ravenous hunger, made something in his chest tighten. "They don't take charity," Linda said quietly, her voice stiff, almost as if she were apologizing for them. "This isn't charity, Linda," Nate replied, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's breakfast." Linda looked down into her coffee mug, but for once she said nothing. By early afternoon, the rain had stopped completely, and a pale, watery sun broke through the clouds. Nate offered to ride with Linda to check on the cabin, but she declined immediately. "It's not your concern," she said, adjusting her shawl as if it were armor. Nate frowned. "It is my concern, Linda. That place can't keep you or these kids safe. One good storm, and it'll be nothing but a pile of splinters." Her jaw tightened. "We've managed this long." "Managed?" he echoed, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so the children couldn't hear. You think I don't know what it's like to be proud? To not want to owe anyone a damn thing? I built this entire place on that feeling. But you're not just thinking for yourself anymore. You've got 4 kids looking to you for everything. That's more weight than anyone should have to carry alone. For a moment, she looked as if she might argue, her eyes flashing with that familiar fire. But then her shoulders sagged slightly. She glanced over at the children, who were now huddled near the hearth, playing quietly with a set of old wooden blocks Nate had found in a dusty trunk. The fight seemed to drain right out of her. "All right," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. Just to check the damage." The cabin was worse than Nate had expected, much worse. The storm had torn off a huge section of the roof, and water was still dripping steadily through a wide crack in the ceiling, forming a large puddle on the dirt floor. The air was heavy with the smell of mildew and wet earth. A makeshift bed of blankets in the corner was soaked through. Linda stood in the doorway, silent, her hand gripping Ruth's tiny shoulder. Her expression was unreadable, a blank mask, but Nate could see the pain in the way she tightened her jaw, the way her breath trembled almost invisibly. "You can't bring them back here," Nate said, his voice gentle but certain. "Not like this." Linda stared at the damp floor, saying nothing. "I've got a house with more rooms than I'll ever use," he continued, stepping closer. "Stay there, at least until we can fix this place. No strings, no debts. Just stay." She finally turned to face him then, her eyes searching his, desperate and confused. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much?" Nate hesitated. There were 100 reasons, 1,000, and none of them were simple enough to explain. "Because I can't stand seeing good people left out in the cold," he said finally. "And because you and those kids, you belong somewhere better than this." For a long, breathless moment, Linda held his gaze. Then, with a quiet sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, she nodded. Back at the ranch, a new, fragile life began to take shape. The children explored timidly at first, then with growing confidence. Nala helped her younger brothers wash up at the outdoor pump, while Ruth clung to Linda's skirt, her little shadow. Nate brought out stacks of old quilts and set up a corner of the main room as a temporary sleeping space. He caught Linda watching him, her expression a confusing mix of gratitude and deep-seated unease. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the valley in shades of amber and rose, Nate cooked a huge pot of beef stew over the hearth. The rich smell filled the house, and for the first time, Linda and her children sat at his long wooden table. "Eat," Nate said, serving each of them a generous bowl. "You don't have to thank me. Just eat." For a moment, a heavy silence reigned as everyone dug in. Ruth let out a small, contented sigh as she tasted the warm broth, and even Nala, the ever-watchful sentinel, allowed herself the ghost of a smile. Nate felt something stir deep inside him, a quiet, profound satisfaction he hadn't known he was missing. When the children were finally asleep, tucked under the warm quilts, Linda stayed behind in the kitchen, carefully washing the dishes. Nate leaned against the doorway, just watching her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I can't just sit while you do everything," she replied, her tone quiet but firm. He studied her for a long moment in the soft lamplight. It caught the lines of exhaustion on her face, but it also illuminated something else, something softer, something incredibly strong. "You don't have to carry everything alone anymore, Linda," he said. Her hands paused on the dishcloth. "I've learned not to expect help," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the soapy water. "Well," Nate said, his voice low and steady, "maybe it's time to unlearn that." For the first time, Linda looked directly at him, her eyes holding his for more than a fleeting heartbeat. Something unspoken, something powerful and new, passed between them. A promise, or maybe a question, that neither of them was ready to name. Later that night, when the house was finally quiet, Nate found himself sitting on the porch, staring up at the blanket of stars. The sound of children breathing softly in the next room, the memory of Linda's guarded, searching gaze. It all made the world feel different, warmer but also heavier, as if a responsibility he never asked for had taken root in his chest. He didn't know where this path would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let Linda or those children be swallowed by the cold ever again. Inside, Linda checked on her children, brushing a stray curl from Ruth's forehead. She paused at the doorway, watching Nate through the window. There was something so steady about him, something she couldn't quite bring herself to distrust. For the first time in years, she allowed a dangerous thought to enter her mind. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just shelter. Maybe this was the beginning of something she had long ago forgotten how to hope for. Safety. The days ahead would test them both in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. But as the fire burned low that night, a fragile sense of belonging began to take shape in the big, empty house, one that neither of them could ignore. The ranch had settled into a fragile new routine over the next few days. Linda and the children stayed in the large house, though she insisted on helping with every single chore to repay Nate's kindness. She rose before dawn, feeding the horses and sweeping the floors, her movements efficient and silent. The children, however, were beginning to shed their caution. They explored the open fields with a mix of wonder and excitement. There was laughter now, soft, tentative laughter from the kitchen when Ruth chased Tom around the table, or when Leo proudly showed Nate how he could carry a small bucket of feed all by himself. Nate found himself drawn to these small moments of joy, a silent observer on the edge of a life he'd never pictured for himself. The house, once a place of polished silence and solitude, now felt alive. But underneath that growing warmth, a current of tension still lingered. Linda still held herself apart, as if she believed this fragile peace could be shattered at any moment. She was right. That unease found its answer late one afternoon. Nate had just returned from repairing a stretch of fence along the southern pasture when he heard the sound of pounding hooves. 3 riders approaching fast from the main road, kicking up a cloud of dust. He stepped onto the porch, his instincts immediately sharpening. The man in front was broad-shouldered with a mean, self-satisfied grin that split his weathered face. Nate didn't recognize him, but the way Linda's breath caught sharply in her throat when she appeared in the doorway told him everything he needed to know. Her face drained of all color. "Raymond," she whispered, the name sounding like a curse. Raymond dismounted with the arrogant swagger of a man who believed the ground itself should bow beneath his boots. "Well, well, if it isn't my dear wife," he drawled, his voice laced with a thick, ugly mockery. "Didn't think you'd be living this high and mighty in a place like this." "I'm not your wife anymore," Linda said, stepping out onto the porch. Her voice was steady, but Nate saw her hands tremble at her sides. Raymond's eyes flicked to Nate, sizing him up with a dismissive sneer. "And who's this? The rich fool buying my kids' affection? Thought you could just run off and take them, did you?" "The children aren't yours," Linda snapped, her voice cracking with sudden fury. "You left them. You left us to starve." Raymond grinned, showing a row of crooked yellow teeth. "Ain't how I see it. The paper says they're mine, and a man's got the right to claim what's his. I'll be taking them now, but I'm a reasonable man. I won't leave you empty-handed. $100 for each of them will settle it." Nate's jaw tightened until it ached. "You're not taking anyone," he said, stepping forward to stand between Raymond and the doorway. His tone was dangerously calm, but there was pure steel beneath it. "Not for money, not for anything." Raymond's 2 companions shifted nervously in their saddles, their hands hovering near the pistols on their belts. The tension in the air cracked like a dry branch underfoot. Raymond let out a low, ugly laugh. "You think you can stand between me and what's mine? Look at you, some rich hermit playing hero. You think a few acres of land make you untouchable? He pulled a folded, grimy piece of paper from his coat and waved it mockingly in the air. See this? My name's right here. Official. You want to argue? You can take it to the judge, but I ain't leaving without them. Nate didn't flinch. I don't care what that paper says. Those children aren't property. And if you take one more step onto this porch, you'll find out exactly how serious I am about keeping them safe. For a single stretched heartbeat, no one moved. Then Raymond lunged forward, shoving hard against Nate's shoulder. Nate answered with a single hard punch that sent Raymond staggering back, a look of shocked surprise on his face. Before Raymond could recover, one of the other men jumped from his horse and swung a wild fist, catching Nate across the jaw. The porch erupted into chaos. Linda screamed for the children who were peering through the window to stay inside. Nate fought with the raw, brutal strength of a man who had spent years wrangling wild horses and unforgiving land. But it was 2 against 1. A heavy boot struck his ribs, and the air rushed out of his lungs. He dropped to one knee, gasping. "Stop it!" Linda cried, stepping forward, her hands outstretched. Raymond grabbed her arm, twisting it cruelly behind her back. "You want to see your fancy man live? Then you hand over the kids right now." Before he could drag her off the porch, a deafening shotgun blast rang out. The sound cracked through the air like a whip of thunder. That's far enough. All eyes snapped toward the sound. Jed, Nate's nearest neighbor, a man he rarely spoke to, was striding down the hill, his old shotgun aimed steady and true. His wife, Martha, followed close behind, clutching an old revolver in her shaking hands, her face a mask of grim determination. "You've got 3 seconds to get off this property," Jed barked, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Or I'll put a round of buckshot right where it hurts." Raymond's confident grin finally faltered. He looked from Jed's unwavering shotgun to Nate, who had struggled back to his feet, blood on his lip, but his eyes burning with a cold, murderous defiance. For a moment, the scene held, stretched as tight as a wire. Then Raymond spat on the clean porch floor and stepped back. "This isn't over," he growled, his voice thick with venom. "The law is on my side, and I'll be back with it." He mounted his horse with a final sneer, his men scrambling to follow. In moments, they were nothing but a cloud of angry dust on the road. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Nate wiped the blood from his lip with the back of his hand and turned to Linda, who stood pale and trembling. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer now. She nodded, though her breath was still coming in ragged gulps. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. He'll just come back stronger." "Then we'll be ready," Nate said firmly, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm not letting him take you or those kids. Not now, not ever." Jed rested his shotgun on his shoulder. "I'll ride into town with you tomorrow, Nate. We'll see the sheriff. Get this mess straightened out once and for all. That man's got no right to threaten a woman and her children like that." Linda looked at the 2 men, her eyes wide with something that looked like a terrifying mix of fear and hope. She wanted to believe them. Nate could see it. But years of hardship and betrayal had taught her not to trust too easily. That night, after Jed and Martha had gone home, Linda tended to Nate's cuts in silence. She gently dabbed a damp cloth against the cut on his brow, her hands trembling just slightly. "You didn't have to fight for us," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. Nate caught her gaze, holding it with a quiet, powerful conviction. "Then tell me, Linda," he said softly, "if I didn't fight for you, who would?" For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth. The children slept peacefully in the next room. It was as if the storm outside had finally given way to a different kind of storm, one brewing inside the walls of the house, between 2 souls who had both spent far too long alone. As the night deepened, Linda stood by the window, staring out into the oppressive dark, knowing that Raymond's shadow would linger over them. Nate, watching her, made a silent vow. Whatever was coming next, whatever fight the law brought to their door, he would not let her face it alone. Tomorrow would bring the courthouse, the law, and the final, brutal reckoning they both knew was inevitable. The courthouse in Helena was even colder than the streets outside, its high ceilings and dark wooden panels swallowing every sound that wasn't the scrape of a boot or the nervous clearing of a throat. Nate sat beside Linda on the long, hard bench, his hat resting on his knee, his broad shoulders tense beneath his good coat. The children were safe with Martha back at the ranch. They didn't need to see this fight, but Linda's face betrayed every fear she was trying so hard to bury. Raymond stood just a few feet away, leaning against the plaintiff's table with that same ugly smirk carved into his face. He was dressed better than Nate had expected, his coat freshly brushed and his dark hair slicked back with grease, as if he believed this cheap performance would make him appear respectable. In his hand was the same crumpled folder of papers he'd flaunted on the porch, his so-called proof of paternity. "You abandoned them," Linda said quietly, her voice barely reaching Nate's ear as they waited for the judge to enter. Raymond glanced at her, his grin twisting cruelly. "I left them with their mama, didn't I? But they're mine on paper, Linda. And in here, paper is all that matters." Nate's jaw tightened. He placed a hand gently over Linda's, trying to ground her. "Paper doesn't raise children," he said, his voice low but firm enough for Raymond to hear. When the judge entered, the room grew still. He was an older man with a shock of silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He flipped through the documents Raymond's lawyer presented, his face showing the detached patience of someone who had seen far too many cases of greed and broken families. "Mrs. Rock," the judge said, his voice echoing in the silent room, "you have no legal adoption papers, no birth certificates registered in your name. According to these documents, Mr. Raymond Rock is indeed the legal father of these 4 children." Linda's breath caught in her throat. Nate could feel her trembling next to him, though her face remained a stoic, composed mask. Raymond's lawyer, a thin, weaselly man with a voice like sandpaper, seized the moment. "Your Honor, my client only wants what is rightfully his. These children belong with their father. A man has the right to reclaim his own blood." Linda's lips parted, but no words came out. What could she say? All she had were memories. Nights spent holding feverish children, days spent splitting meager meals between 4 hungry mouths, years spent shielding them from every cruel hand the world had to offer. None of that was written on any page, and in this cold, heartless room, it seemed like that was all that counted. Before the silence could harden into a final, crushing defeat, the sharp sound of a cane tapping against the wooden floor broke the moment. "Your Honor, if I may," a woman's voice called out, thin but clear. Everyone in the courtroom turned. An elderly woman, hunched with age but fierce with purpose, stood at the back of the room. Her cane, polished smooth from years of use, trembled slightly as she leaned on it. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, but her eyes were as sharp as the day she'd been born. Nate recognized her instantly. It was Esther, the old widow who lived in a small cabin near the woods, a recluse who rarely left her home except to buy flour and kerosene. "With all due respect," Esther said, her voice gaining strength as she walked slowly but steadily forward. "I saw this man." She pointed a crooked, trembling finger directly at Raymond. "Come to the Callahan Ranch looking for Linda Rock. He didn't come to take those children out of love. He came to sell them. $100 apiece," he said. He said it as if they were cattle. A shocked murmur swept through the room. The judge raised a hand, calling for silence. "Mrs. Esther, are you saying you were a direct witness to this claim?" I'm saying I heard him with my own 2 ears, she replied, standing as tall as her bent spine would allow. I was gathering firewood. I saw the whole thing. I saw how Mr. Callahan stood between this woman and that brute. I saw the blood on his face after he defended them. If justice in this town means anything at all, it means that these children stay with the one who protected them, not the one who tried to barter away their lives for a handful of silver. Raymond's face twisted into an ugly snarl. She's a half-blind old hag. What does she know? The judge's gaze cut to him sharply. Mind your tongue in my courtroom, Mr. Rock. He turned back to Esther, his expression softening slightly. Thank you for your testimony, ma'am. The old woman nodded once, then returned to her bench with the same quiet dignity she'd walked in with. The judge leaned back in his tall chair, his hands folded over the documents. For a long, agonizing moment, the room was silent, except for the scratching of his pen against the folder. Then he closed it with a soft thud. This court recognizes Linda Rock as the sole guardian of the 4 minors in question, he declared, his voice ringing with finality. Full and irrevocable custody is hereby granted to her. Mr. Rock's claims are dismissed. The relief hit Linda like a physical wave. She closed her eyes as hot tears streamed down her cheeks, washing away years of fear. Nate reached for her hand, gripping it tightly, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. Raymond slammed his fist on the table, his face contorted with rage. "You'll regret this!" he barked, but the bailiff stepped forward, his hand resting ominously on the hilt of his weapon. "Enough!" the judge said firmly. "This case is closed." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Linda sat on the wagon seat beside Nate, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The snow along the roadside glittered in the pale afternoon sun, but the heaviness in her shoulders still hadn't lifted. "You're safe now," Nate said finally, breaking the silence. "No one can ever take them from you." Linda turned to him, her eyes shining with a gratitude so deep it was painful to see. "I don't know how to thank you," she murmured. "If you hadn't—" "You don't need to thank me," he interrupted softly. "I'd do it again. Every time." She looked at him then, really looked at him, as if she were searching for something deeper. But then she just shook her head and faced the road again. Nate didn't press her. He understood. When they reached the ranch, the children ran out to meet them, their joyous laughter filling the cold air. Nala clutched Linda's waist as if she'd never let go, while Tom and Leo tugged at Nate's coat, asking if everything was all right. Nate crouched down to Ruth's level, gently brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "Everything's fine now," he said, a genuine smile reaching his eyes. But as the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting long, dark shadows across the yard, a new shadow fell across their fragile peace. Near the chicken coop, white feathers were scattered like freshly fallen snow, and the wooden fence had been kicked apart. And there, on the big barn door, scrawled in rough, angry red charcoal, were 2 words. "You lose!" Linda's hand flew to her mouth, a small gasp escaping her lips. Nate's face hardened, his jaw setting like stone. He didn't say a word as he strode to the stable and pulled down his saddle. His cold, deadly silence spoke louder than any threat. "Where are you going?" Linda asked, her voice tight with a new, fresh wave of worry. "To the sheriff," he said, his voice flat and hard. "This ends tonight." As he mounted his horse and spurred it into a gallop, the last rays of sun burned the horizon a deep, bloody red, as if warning that another storm, one made of men and rage, was on its way. The knock at the ranch door came long after nightfall, long after the children had fallen into an exhausted sleep. Linda had just finished tucking the last quilt around Ruth when the sound echoed through the quiet house. 3 steady, deliberate raps. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Nate opened the door to the biting chill of the evening and stepped inside, his coat wet with sleet and thick mud clinging to his boots. He didn't say a word at first. He just walked to the table and placed a folded telegram on the polished wood. His expression was calm, but sharpened with a final hard resolve. "Raymond's in custody," he said, his voice low and even. "The sheriff caught him and his friends trying to head north. He confessed to the threats, the vandalism, everything. He won't be back, Linda. Ever." Linda let out a slow, shuddering breath, a sound that seemed to carry years of pent-up fear with it. Her shoulders, which had been tight with tension for as long as she could remember, finally began to ease. She pressed a hand against the table to steady herself, her legs suddenly weak with relief. "It's over," she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. "For good," Nate replied, his tone softening. "You don't have to keep looking over your shoulder anymore, Linda, not here." She nodded, though the weight of her past still clung to her like a persistent shadow. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You've done more for us than anyone ever has." Nate looked at her then, his eyes steady and warm in the lamplight. "I didn't do it for thanks," he said. "I just couldn't stand by and watch you fight this alone." The following morning, sunlight poured into the valley, pale and golden, melting the last of the frost. It felt like the first real morning. Nate and Linda stepped outside together, watching as the children darted around the yard, their energy boundless. Nala and Leo chased Tom near the barn while Ruth toddled after them, her high-pitched laughter rising like bells in the clear, crisp air. "They don't even remember being afraid," Linda murmured, a note of wonder in her voice. "Children forget so easily." Nate shook his head, a faint smile touching his lips. "Not everything. They'll remember that you fought for them. They'll remember that you never, ever let go." Linda looked at him, her gaze steady, finally unclouded by fear. "I couldn't have done it without you," she admitted softly. The simple words hung in the air between them, and Nate felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He'd spent years believing that solitude was safer, that it was easier. But watching Linda with her children, seeing life and warmth and laughter bloom inside a house that had been nothing but silence for so long, he finally understood what he'd been missing. That afternoon, they rebuilt the chicken coop together. Nala, serious and focused, carried nails in a tin can. Leo fetched scraps of wood. Tom, wanting to be just like Nate, pretended to hammer beside him, copying every move with an earnest determination that made Nate chuckle. Ruth sat happily in the grass, gathering the scattered white feathers into a small basket as if they were priceless treasures. Linda worked beside Nate, holding the board steady while he drove the nails, her sleeves rolled up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. There was a quiet, easy rhythm to their work, the steady sound of hammer strikes, the murmur of children's voices, the wind whispering through the tall pines. "You've got good helpers," Nate said, glancing at her. "They're all I have," she replied, though her tone was softer now, filled with love instead of desperation. "And I'd do anything to keep them safe." "You already have," he said quietly, "but you don't have to do it alone anymore." Linda paused, her hand resting on the edge of the new wooden frame. She looked at him, her eyes searching his face, as if finally, truly weighing whether she could believe those words. "I've learned not to expect help," she murmured, the old habit of distrust dying hard. "Well," Nate said with a small, genuine smile, "maybe it's time to change that." By evening, the coop stood sturdy and new, and the children were covered in dust and beaming with pride. They all sat under the wide cottonwood tree near the corral, sharing bread and cheese and apples, the cool earth serving as their table. Ruth, without a moment's hesitation, climbed right into Nate's lap, and he rested his large, calloused hand gently on her back, a strange, powerful tenderness settling over him like a quiet truth. Mama, Ruth said softly, tugging at Linda's sleeve. Can we stay here? Linda looked at Nate, her heart pounding at the simple, innocent question. That's up to Mr. Callahan, she said carefully, her voice catching slightly. Nate looked down at the small girl in his lap, then at the other three children watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. His gaze finally settled on Linda. From now on, he said, his voice clear and unwavering, this is home for all of you. No one ever needs to ask if they belong here. Ruth didn't answer with words. She simply wrapped her small arms around his neck, pressing her face into the rough fabric of his shirt. And Nate Callahan, the man who had built a fortress to keep the world out, felt something profound settle inside him. Something that felt a whole lot like family. That night, the ranch glowed with life. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting warm, dancing light across the walls. The children sat on the floor while Nala read aloud from an old book she'd found, her voice clear and sure. Linda stood in the kitchen, washing dishes with a calm, peaceful expression Nate had never seen on her before. He sat at the table carving a piece of walnut, his knife working a small, intricate shape out of the wood. When she finished her chores, Linda walked over, drying her hands on her apron. Her gaze lingered on the small figure he was shaping. It was a rooster, its wings outstretched, its head thrown back in a silent crow. You made this? She asked softly. Thought it might belong out there with the new coop, he said without looking up. New life deserves something to guard it. Linda's fingers hovered over the nearly finished carving, then rested gently on his hand, stopping his work. You've given us more than a roof, Nate. You've given us something I thought I'd lost forever. Hope. He finally looked up at her then, the warmth of her touch stirring something deep within him. You don't have to fight anymore, Linda, he said, his voice low. Not here. Not with me. For a long moment, they just stood there, the firelight reflecting in their eyes. Then Linda's voice, barely above a whisper, broke the silence. If it's not too much to ask, she said, her voice trembling slightly, I'd like to be called Linda Callahan one day. Nate closed his eyes briefly, the words sinking into him like a promise he hadn't even dared to hope for. When he opened them again, he smiled, a slow, certain smile that reached all the way to his soul. Welcome home, he said. Linda Callahan. The seasons passed, and the Callahan Ranch became more than just a house on a hill. It became a home, a place where children's laughter carried on the wind, where kindness grew stronger than fear, and where two lives once broken and utterly alone found their way to each other. Nate often found himself watching Linda from the porch as she read to the children in the yard or worked in the garden she had planted, her hair glowing in the late afternoon sun. And each day he realized more deeply that his wealth, his land, his entire empire meant nothing without this. A family, a purpose, a place to truly belong. In the quiet moments, when Linda would rest her hand on his, or when Ruth would climb onto his lap, giggling, Nate finally knew the truth. He had spent years building fences to keep the world out. But it wasn't until a tired, mysterious woman walked up his long dirt road that he finally found everything he'd been missing all along. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance at happiness, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will touch your heart.